All right, Rich, you're all set to begin.
Yeah, do I need to get rid of this continue on here, huh?
Oh,
Yeah, go ahead and click continue.
Okay,
We're
okay,
we're just recording the session for people who want to come back and watch
Okay.
later.
sure, okay. Well, I guess I can go ahead and start here. I was gonna have slides here. I'll be putting up on the screen here shortly in a second or two here, but I just want to welcome everyone here. It's great to be with everyone, even though I can't see everyone. But I've been a member of the Tekawitha Conference going back to 2010. And so I've been also involved in other aspects of this, especially the last 4 years. The problem of Indian poverty. I've been up to Pine Ridge a number of times, and I'm actually helped Father Mike Carson. I'm sure you heard his keynote and everything. And I've been trying to help him any way I can to support the USCCB and the Black and Indian office in Washington, D.C. So that's sort of where I've been of late. But the topic of Indian law, I tried to get my hands around this a while back. In fact, I gave a similar talk in Ohio 2 years ago at Sharonville for the conference there, and it was well attended. So I thought I'd go ahead and give another shot at this, which will actually should feed into my topic for tomorrow on the problem of socialism, socialist policies on Indian reservations. So I felt this would be a good primer for that. But really, we need to understand our history. As you know, the value in understanding history is so we can solve the problems of today. What changes need to be made. So it helps give us wisdom moving forward. And also to put away some of the myths that we hear often as well, if we understand history better and what really has happened over the years. And so I know some of you will be probably familiar with some of the points I'm bringing up, but hopefully we can get our hands around it in one shot here and gain something from it. Okay, I'm going to go to screen share now, bring the slides up. All right, give me a second here. I'll get that up there. All right. Let's start from the beginning. Let's hope my picture still. How's that look? All right. Can everyone see that all right? Okay, I guess we're okay. Move out. All right. So, okay, well, where do we begin? Well, maybe we should just begin at the beginning, right? And my starting point's about 500 years ago, 15th century, on what has been termed the rule of discovery. The rule of discovery. It's important to understand because it has much to do with our ability and the inherent rights of peoples, our natives, to govern themselves. In short, their sovereignty. And its demise impacts many social justice issues that in turn arise, that has been in the case of our land that occupied, of course, first by our natives. But the doctrine of discovery at its core was a religious doctrine. It first appeared in Spain and then was later adopted by the British and then worked its way into the US Constitution and federal legislation ever since. So we need to understand this. When the New World was being discovered, the question was, who was to take possession of these newly discovered lands? Right? In 1492, acting under the international laws of Western Christendom, Columbus was to take possession of the land for Spain. So what are these so-called laws? All right, well, first of all, they took shape from two papal decrees, or papal bills as it was called back then, one in 1452, which was before Columbus, and later in 1493. What was the intent? Well, there's two sides to the story here. It's clear from the careful reading of the text of these papal documents that the Vatican intended two things. One, to recognize and defend any Spanish claim. And second, it's not only talking about the land, but rather than those encountered with an obligation by Spain to bring these people of the new land to Christianity, to the Catholic Church. So the goal was to implant Christianity. And we have to understand the historical situation back then too, and prevent non-Christian rulers and enemies of Christ to lay any claims at that time. This was a time when Islam was spreading across Europe, right? You remember the Battle of Lepanto, that was kind of coming up in the future there, shortly thereafter. So very important time in Christian history across Europe there. But anyway, the former, as you see up on the screen, don't do this, was most controversial and was written before Columbus, before any knowledge of the New World, when the reigning Pope also had no idea about the existence of any people in the New World. Nor did Pope Nicholas and later Alexander I at that time intend that all indigenous people should lose their land and become slaves. In fact, shortly after, Pope Paul III, this is in 1537 now, and so let us do this. Got another slide here. Let me get back up to him. There he is. I have this quote here: Indians and all other people who may later be discovered by Christians are by no means to be enslaved, deprived of their liberty or the possession of their property, even though they may be outside the faith of Jesus Christ. So this statement occurring, 45 years or whatever, 50 years after Columbus. All right. So Catholic social teachings and papal statements ever since, such as the Second Vatican Council and that of Pope St. John Paul II, have repeated this stance, strongly repudiating mistreatment of indigenous peoples. On the other side, the driving force of the rule of discovery, especially as it continued to take hold over time, was no longer religious, it was money. You know, that's what always comes down to, right? Money. Energized too by the political landscape of the times and then since. But words, you know, have consequences and can form the basis of reality. The misinterpretations and the misuse of the original intent of these early decrees, fueled by wording and terms such as lawful spoil, with conquering nations having the right to have absolute title and ultimate authority over any newly discovered inhabitants, has had dire consequences as it relates to our native peoples here. A discussion on the rule of discovery can be rather lengthy, so I just wanted to basically just get our hands around it in general here to see how it started, and now we're going to see how it sort of unfolded as we move forward. A few minutes and provide some sort of historical overview of federal Indian law, congressional legislation, and developments in the courts as well. Now, first, dispelling a common myth. The American Indians, by and large, especially the Lakota Sioux of Pine Ridge, were not pagans. This is an important point here. You know that in my involvement with the Lakota, they believed in one God as their creator. They knew astronomy. They had a well-developed culture in music and art with strong familial ties and can be considered Christian virtues. These can be considered Christian virtues. In fact, it explains a large part why Nicholas Black Elk, who, of course, his cause is up for canonization, is progressing well. The Lakota Spirituality really was a friend to the Jesuits and Franciscans. Those missionaries coming into the area, it actually made it easier to move and transition to Catholicism. So anyway, with that aside, another key point, unlike the Europeans, the American Indian had a totally different view of the land, as you know, that the land didn't belong to anyone, right? As opposed to the Europeans that believed the land was there for the taking. The right to claim and settle the land as they migrated westward. So land claims for them through treaties and other arrangements with the tribes were appropriate vehicle for designating ownership. Related, the natives of spirituality was also tied to the land. You know, the Europeans had their churches, buildings, and structures as their sacred space, right? But for the Indians, the land was the church. Designated areas they regarded as sacred. So this, of course, led to disputes down the road, impending disputes over sacred lands like the Black Hills. Now, one can see readily the tension that started to develop in time as the Europeans, under the legitimacy of the rule of discovery, pressed westward. Tribal communities could never have imagined the problems and challenges that these Europeans brought with them. You know, in the colonial days, the British had prevailed in the East, as you know, but in extending their reach in time, the colonial demand for more land began the long pattern of removal of natives from their homeland with hardships, strained relationships, and of course, later the Indian Wars. And I think we know all this, but in 1763, interestingly enough, the British issued a royal proclamation an attempt to improve relations using they were the first ones that used the term Indian country, describing and negotiating land west of the Appalachians. Here, the laws of the Indians prevailed. Settlers were able to be subject to these laws, prohibiting colonists from going into these lands. And in many ways, this was helped as a catalyst for the Revolutionary War because people wanted the free access to these lands. But anyway, then came the US Constitution, which was adopted in 1789. Tribes were considered and mentioned as separate sovereigns, not taxed, also suggesting an economic relationship in the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. One of the initial acts passed by the first Congress was the Indian Trade and Intercourse Act of 1790. This is the first law that the government, the US government, began to rule and to regulate trade between the natives and the colonists. But it's a benchmark, I think, because Congress from here on out had absolute and broad power now to pass legislation over Indian tribes, later recognized by the Supreme Court to include any treaties. We'll get to the Supreme Court a bit later, but well, what is a treaty? I mean, we got to think about that today. What is a treaty? It's a contract, right? Normally between nations. One pledges its word to another. And in time, the US entered into 400 treaties. Most tribes had at least one treaty, treaties of peace, no war. But then to relinquish land, the government wanted. And sometimes, as you know, they were under extreme duress, sometimes under starvation or a military defeat. Furthermore, and this is important too, in taking these lands by treaty, the government also took on a trust responsibility to provide services, food, medical education, and protecting the remaining lands and the resources. And we see this unfold as we go back to the early 1800s. And here comes the Supreme Court now. All right, the Supreme Court. Between 1823 and 1832, we find a series of 3 important US Supreme Court cases under, you see him up in the upper left, John Marshall, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, which provides the basic framework for the status of Indian tribes all the way up to today, in the US today. Do Indians have land rights? Well, up to this point, yeah, they did. Indians always had the right to have a land title, to live there and not to be trespassed upon. Most significant in this trilogy of cases, these 3 cases, the one that I want to focus on and is most overlooked is the Johnson versus McIntosh case in 1823. Here is where the rule of discovery is quietly adopted into US law unanimously by the Supreme Court. So in short, Marshall observed that Christian European nations had assumed ultimate dominion over our lands during this age of discovery, and that upon discovery, the Indians had lost their rights to complete sovereignty as independent nations and only retained the right of occupancy of the land. See, so this is an extremely important case here in the Supreme Court. In other words, Indian nations were subject to the ultimate authority of the first nation of Christendom to claim possession of a given region of Indian land, right? The successor to Great Britain, of course, now is the independent United States, became the successor nation then to the right of discovery and acquired the power of dominion. Drawing attention away from its religious bias, then, Marshall stated that, and I'm quoting from him here, discovery gave title to the government by whose subject or by whose authority the discovery was made against all other European governments, right? And this went back all the way back really to the English Charter, Henry Cabot operating under this rule of discovery. Now I have a quote here from Red Cloud up on the screen. I think that's appropriate. But the discovery of these lands, notwithstanding the occupancy of the natives who were heathens, this is the wording in the Supreme Court here, at the same time, admitting the prior title of any Christian people who may had previous discovery, all right? So, well, I think that's coming out of the Cabot, all the way back to that English Charter. Now, Marshall now had this term unoccupied lands. And he used this term to refer to the lands in America that were discovered by Britain, but were occupied by the Indians, but unoccupied by Christians. So the rule of discovery, or the law of nations, as it's sometimes called, is now unobtrusively transferred to US law. All right. And this is the birth of the aforementioned trust relationship. All right, as I mentioned a minute ago. So Marshall now called attention to a trust relationship, a guardian ward relationship related to the Indians. Now think about that today. What do we usually apply that to? Children or mentally retarded, right? I mean, it's absurd to even think they would even express it in that way. But anyway, but then we get to Jackson, and we know what happened here, 1828. And he supported Western expansion and manifest destiny. And toward this end, this is where we have the policy of removing tribes from their homeland. So we arrive at another benchmark when tribal sovereignty becomes limited by federal Indian laws passed by and through the Supreme Court and congressional acts. And the first victims were what? The Cherokee, right? When we know that, where more than 4,000 Cherokee people died, 100,000 removed from the southeast US, over 25,000 died there. So all told, so very sad time in our history. But by the way, for a Native American, unlike the Europeans, it's not okay to move from place to place, as you know, to give up their family graves, the spirits in the rivers, the burial sites, and so forth, to leave everything that was dear to them. And people don't understand this. You know, I meet a lot of people on the street or whatever I converse with it, and they say, why do they stay on the reservations? Why don't they just move off the reservation, get assimilated into the United States? Well, listen, and the example I give them, suppose you have a farmhouse and in the backyard are buried all of your relatives going back 200 years, and the government comes through and wants to put a highway through there. Would you be willing to get rid of the land? You know, it's the same. It's just now. I think that's a pretty good analogy to show what they faced here. People don't understand that. So among other things, but I'll get to more of that perhaps a little later. But anyway, but they have the connection to the land. This policy accelerated now in the late 1800s in time by military force. And it still continues today in a way, as continuing, displaced into reservations further west by treaties and executive orders or whatever. But let's stop here for a minute. Let's just pause for a minute. What is a reservation? Well, it's a piece of land set aside by the government who will set the boundary where the tribe and tribal government occupies the land. That's obvious. The land is owned by the federal government who has a trust or title to that, all right? The tribe, as I said before, only has the right to occupy the land. The federal government can terminate or remove them anytime they want. And this has been done in the past. Another benchmark is 1871. The practice of making treaties with Indians end at that point. And from that on, Congress no longer negotiated with Indian tribes, but simply now regulated Indian affairs through legislation. Okay. That what's up on the screen, as it says there, it's the Black Hills Treaty, the original printing there on the treaty there. But anyway, so in 1883 in the Black Hills, the Lakota Black Hills, we have the killing of Chief Spotted Tail by Crow Dog, an incident which leads to yet another major change in federal Indian policy related to who decides punishment after a crime. Now, without going into all the details, while the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Lakota laws, Congress disagreed. And what did they do? They passed the Indian Federal Crimes Act, the Indian Federal Crimes Act. This, again, illustrates how Congress and the federal government has broad powers over Indian affairs and can create federal Indian law at a whim. Also, the Supreme Court can make a ruling that in fact becomes law, and it stays there until Congress changes it. It just stays that way. And then, as Father Carson just got done speaking about here minutes ago, we have the assimilation process, right, where aimed at assimilating people into the mainstream of society here to erase any trace of their heritage. Very, very sad time, obviously. You know, I find it interesting here in Houston. We tried to get a separate Native American ministry going, but the Native Americans, and by the way, there's thousands of Native American heritage people in Houston that have Indian blood in them and so forth. They just lump them in with the Hispanics. So, why can't we have separate for, well, anyway, that's a separate problem, but, I think this is probably a common practice, is that just lumped in with the Hispanic population. But anyway, okay, so the worst case example is the separation of Indian children, obviously from their families, sent to non-Indian boarding schools, prohibited from speaking their language and practicing their religion and so forth. And this problem has really flowed down to today, because a lot of the elderly, especially, don't know how to parent anymore. They were on these boarding schools, in these boarding schools, out of a family environment, so they lack parenting skills even to this day. Okay, so just another side note of that. So attempts to accomplish this have attributed to still increasing strained relationships at that time. So in this whole process, Congress has since passed laws resulting in the loss of 90 million acres of Indian reservation lands. That's about the size of California. All right. And this brings us to the notorious Dawes. I don't have very good names for these law acts, do I? Notorious Dawes Act, or the General Allotment Act of 1887. This authorized the president to survey American Indian land and divide it into allotments for individual Indians, whether they wanted them or not. So for the first time, the Indian owned real estate. But remember, the concept is totally foreign to the Indian, who no one owns the land. So a lot of them didn't bother to take it. Not wanting it, the land was what? It was sold back to non-Indians. So the result is tens of thousands of non-Indians moving into reservation lands and owning this land. All right. And 2/3 of the land holdings prior to 1887 were now gone, lost from the tribes to the non-Indians. And what do we end up with? The slide here. This is the Pine Ridge area. You have all this fractionated land resulting here. 2/3 of the land holdings, like I just mentioned, were lost. And so the lands are now fractionated, kind of a checkerboard arrangement. And now, can you imagine a Walmart moving in here, or a large development, or that's what you've got in front of you here. It is also a loss of wildlife habitat, and non-Indian populations, as I said, move in, and this contributes to the assimilation process, using the land as the vehicle. Use the land as the vehicle instead here. So anyway, so that takes us that takes us through the late 1800s. All right. But by 1900, then we find that most natives were living in despair, as you can imagine, under deplorable living conditions, poor housing. But that brings us to the 1928 Marion report, which again punctuated the criticality of land fractionating and the conditions present in the boarding schools, health concerns, and so forth. Well, that led up to Franklin Roosevelt after he was elected president. And we get to the 1934 Indian Reorganization Act. That's called the Howard Wheeler Act, using countermeasures to implement reforms. I have this on the slide here. I can follow along here, but reforms. During the Depression, it attempted to stop the allotment process and allow tribes to reorganize as they did, almost like a failing business, you might say, like a failing business would be. But anyway, so it acknowledged that tribes have governments and are viable political entities, and it could develop a system of government that they choose, ultimately setting in place mechanisms to form tribal business enterprises. All right. It was well-intentioned, but it really did not disturb existing private land ownership, still leaving the checkerboard land pattern that we have today. All right. Now, one of the outstanding or important, you might say, books that have been generated is the 1942 Felix Cohen Handbook. He was an associate solicitor for Indian affairs, and he wrote this detailed handbook on federal Indian law, and it remains in the enduring fundamental guide on Indian law today, even to this day. In that book, he would state, like the miner's canary, The Indian marks the shift from fresh air to poison gas in our political atmosphere. And our treatment of Indians, even more than other minorities, marks the rise and fall of our democratic faith. Right? Strong statement on that. And then we're getting to citizenship now. We have, of course, despite the American Indians fighting valiantly as volunteers in every war since our founding, they don't gain their citizenship till 1924. But then after gaining their citizenship and after World War II, federal Indian law policy shifted back again to assimilation and even policies terminating Indian tribes as well. And then we have the civil rights legislation. I know I'm kind of jumping here fairly quickly, but in the time we have here to get through this, but this is in 1968 after signing the Civil Rights Bill. We have the Indian Civil Rights Act, the ICRA to abbreviate, intended by Congress to infer that the people subject to tribal authority have the same basic constitutional rights contained in the US Constitution, including those living on reservations. Well, seemingly okay. Unfortunately, it's still controversial because for the first time, Congress now limits the powers of tribal government in their internal affairs, telling them what they can or can't do with respect to self-government on a reservation. This is a downside of this. And it limited those powers by giving to the people who are subject to tribal authority certain rights and protections against government abuse. So both Indians and non-Indians can go to court and say the tribe is violating one of my rights listed in the Indian Civil Rights Act. Okay, so yeah, it's just the way it turns out. You know, it's amazing how there's always a downside to a lot of the attempts at fixing the problem. And another important one, 1975, the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. This was under the Nixon administration. It was instrumental in changing the federal policy toward natives to strengthen the Indian sense of autonomy without threatening the sense of community. So under this spirit, Congress passed an act that initiated the current era of tribal self-determination and services provided. The Bureau of Indian Affairs now no longer provided all the services. The tribes now could administer and manage some of their services and programs through contracts with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but it had some shortcomings, as you could expect here. But it did start a grassroots movement. That was an important thing where Native Americans would now be more proactive in working toward bettering the conditions. Related is the 1978 Indian Child Welfare Act. It's another one that came around. Tribes could now assert their sovereignty over child custody. While having this right, they also had a mechanism to accomplish this. But again, like many federal laws related to Native Americans today, it was passed with good intentions, but it also has been taken to an extreme, sometimes to the detriment of the child. You can see how this could end up with, you know, who has custody over the child and all of that. It has caused other problems too, but again, well-intentioned. And then we have one of my favorites, the 1988 Indian Gaming Regulation Act, where finally, you know, in 1970s, gaming began to occur on reservations. Great source of revenue, but here comes the federal government marching in to regulate the gaming. Okay, so while nothing more than an exercise of Indian sovereignty and self-determination, this regulatory act was passed to regulate this practice, giving states a limited role in control over these tribes who wish to pursue this. You know, and a lot of people, I talk to people all the time, and I've mentioned about the poverty on some of these reservations. Say, oh, aren't they all rich from the casinos? Only 60% of tribes have casinos, first of all. So, you know, again, here again, we need to educate in that regard. But it has been successful for a number of tribes, and I've visited some that have the casinos, and that is a positive thing that's happened. And requiring tribes to have tribal compact first and then state approval of the 600, and I don't know if I've got this number right, it changes sometimes, but I have 567 recognized tribes. 60% of those, as I said, don't have gaming operations there, but some tribes have benefited from it, and that's a good thing. Let's go on to current trends. Some of these up here. Again, what did I say? 567. I have 573. I don't have them. I'm not going to hold on to this number here. It may have changed, but 573 federally recognized tribes in the U.S. With associated privileges and responsibilities. The Supreme Court has always had a role to protect the small minority or dispossessed people of our land. And from the 1960s through most of the 80s, in an inspiring way, they in fact recognize this. And Indian rights and tribal sovereignty and jurisdiction and the trust relationship are responsibilities. Tribes would bring their grievances to the courts, and most of them were honored. But by the late 1980s, instead, the courts have been, instead of advancing in this regard, there's been a sharp reversal. And this includes the area of religious freedom that was covered in the 1978 Indian Religious Freedom Act, called ARFA, A-I-R-F-A. But out of these Supreme Court cases, we've lost 23 out of 28 cases during the 1990s. So there was a sharp reversal in the Supreme Court's attitude toward this, I suppose, but it's disappointing on the cases lost. But here we have the area of religious freedom. There's Bear Butte. I climbed Bear Butte, and let's see, I guess that was 4 years ago. I was 70 years old, and I climbed it in an hour and 15 minutes on an 85-degree day. That was pretty good. But it was a very privileged honor to be able to climb that butte, of course, in South Dakota. But anyway, this whole act was to protect the traditional religious rights and cultural practices of American Indians, but it has not fared well either with the courts. See, so the courts have not been too friendly over these more recent years with regard to these. Now, we should mention real quickly about the Bureau of Indian Affairs. I'm doing pretty good on my time here. The two primary agencies, of course, charged with overseeing the activities of, 1 million plus Indians plus who live on reservations. We have the Bureau of Indian Affairs, of course, the BIA, and the Bureau of Indian Education. Both of them are part of the Department of Interior. And of course, I have the new head on the right up there, Highland, as the new Department of Interior head. It was formed in 1824 by the Secretary of War, John Calhoun. He's on the left up there on the slide. And he created the agency as a division within this department, without authorization from the U.S. Congress. In 1849, Indian Affairs was transferred to the U.S. Department of Interior, which renamed the Office of Indian Affairs and Bureau of Indian Affairs, from the Office of Indian Affairs to the Bureau of Indian. Still don't have that right. It was renamed from the Office of Indian Affairs to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. That was in 1947. But it's responsible for the administration and management of 55 million plus acres of land held in trust in the U.S. for the Native Americans. And it is one of two bureaus under jurisdiction of the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs. And that also includes the Bureau of Indian Education, as I said, which supposedly is to provide education services for approximately 48,000 Native Americans. It also provides healthcare services, although that function was transferred in 1954 to what now the Department of Health and Human Services, and under that the Indian Healthcare Service. So it's been changed and modified since, but there have been continuous charges of mismanagement and corruption. I have a whole page of notes on that. I'm going to skip over that and just get to something that's really important, I think, and that is the funds. How does the money get down to the tribes through the system here? I find it interesting because when I go to the schools on the reservation, one of the first things they say is, the money never reaches us. The money never reaches us. And I try to do it in a little schematic here in a very simplistic way here, where you have the taxpayer up on the right. He's paying taxes, he or she's paying taxes. It goes to Congress. Congress has funding, and it funds the money to the Department of Interior. And the Department of Interior, of course, then issues its budget to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Bureau of Indian Education, Well, coming from the other end, down in the lower right, we have a government school on the reservation. It needs $1. Okay, so it goes to the local tribal government. Probably 10 cents is lost somewhere in there. Then it goes from there back up to the Bureau of Indian Affairs asking for 90 cents. The money comes back to the tribes, back through the tribal government, and the school gets $0.10. And that's about how it works. This is what I've been able to do. I don't know how all of this is. It just doesn't seem like a very efficient system, does it? And that's why when I go to a school, they say, we just never see the money. It just never gets down to us. And I've been trying to work with the Bureau. COVID has stopped a lot of my efforts to work with the Bureau, the Department of Interior. I had an appointment with the governor of South Dakota last year. I mean, all of that just got derailed with the COVID mess, but hopefully we can maybe start finding out a better way to do things there. Here's another point here of contention I have, that is the multi-million-dollar Bureau of Indian Affairs facility in Aberdeen, South Dakota. And on the right is the Ogallala District Mobile Home for the Elderly. Where's the money going? As I have here now, these figures are a few years old now, but the BIA combined budget of $3 billion a year is 9,000 employees. That's one employee for every 111 Indians on a reservation. 850 million to educate 42,000 students. That's 20,000 per student versus the national average of $12,400. So you see, again, something's wrong here with the distribution of the money. Okay, so at any rate, this has been my experience on Pine Ridge. I have some good news with this, but when I was there the last 2 or 3 years, these are my photographs of the asbestos on the pipes under the carpeting. The school is falling apart. It was built in the 1950s. I can go on with the fire code violations and everything. I did hear good news that they think they're going to go ahead and build a new school. This is in Manderson, and I've been working with the school very closely, trying to get supplies and clothing, whatever else up there. But I think it's summarized really well with former John Klein representative from Minnesota when he stated, you've got collapsing roofs, leaking roofs, buckling floors, exposed wires, popping circuit breakers, gas leaks. That's totally unacceptable. You can't be well educated, in my opinion, when you're attending a school wearing your coat, wearing your mittens, and hoping that the blanket keeps out the 30-degree below zero air. It is very difficult up there, and we continue to pray hard that we can resolve some of these school issues, try to get supplies. We have efforts to provide propane as well to many of the residents up there. But let me move toward a conclusion because I'm getting close to the end. I wanted to make a few points here at the end. When I first got on Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in 2017, I went to a house to collect a water sample. This is not the house in the view here, but and the dad came out and he got a water sample for me. I was going to bring it back to Houston and get it tested here in Houston. And he said something to me that stuck with me all this time. We have no hope. It'll always be like this. This shouldn't be. There's no reason for this. When you look back at all these years and, you look at the children there, what is their future? A Sitting Bull would say, let us put our minds together and see what life we can make for our children. Okay. I look at it in 4 ways. I call it the 4 S's: sovereignty, self-governance, self-sufficiency, sustainability. All right. We must put an end to all of this here. It's ridiculous. And so hopefully, God willing, these are things, and I think the church can play an important part in this, but also education to people on what's going on here. I had one comment from a Native American who said to me, we are resilient. We will survive. We will endure. These are typically words of an oppressed people. Why should they have to endure these conditions? All right. I'll put these on a slide here. The system is broken. It's broken because, and I'm just reading off my notes here, it's on the screen here, but because of the vacuum created by federal unwillingness to intrude upon the activities of tribes when it involves the well-being and constitutional rights of its citizens, the same as all Americans. Second, because of the general neglect of Congress, who continues to perpetuate the bureaucratic swamp known as the BIA with no accountability. Third, because the reservation socialized system of government subsidizes and does not work. And that's what we're going to be talking about tomorrow, these socialized systems. And so this is, I have another something here I wrote here from another author. If tribal leader attitudes and Washington policies don't change soon, another generation of Indians will be lost to the epidemics of drugs, abuse, and suicide. If Americans owe something to Indians, it's surely the basic protections we afford as all Americans. All right. We have two choices the way we see it. America should give Indians as much money as possible from federal coffers. It's only fair that the nation make good on its promises to provide for them, or we make them self-sufficient, regain their sovereignty, ensure that they don't have to continue to suffer the indignities of living in extreme poverty on Indian reservations. All right. And one more here from an author. I'll probably give you the name of this author. I put a wonderful book out recently, but it's not the history of forced assimilation, war, and mass murder that have left American Indians in a deplorable state. It's the federal government's laws and policies today. These policies were begun by officials who didn't know or didn't care about what might help Indians. Today, they're carried on by officials who claim to care but don't seem to grasp the problems these policies are causing. And there she is down at the bottom, Naomi Riley, New Trail of Tears, excellent book, highly recommend. Naomi Riley, New Trail of Tears, very good book, has a lot of great information in it. One more, American Indians want to be part of this country, and they see the markers of their success in the same way that most other Americans do. They want their children to be well educated, to have the opportunity to choose the best life path for themselves, to make enough money and pursue fulfilling jobs while retaining strong family and community ties and holding close to the traditions of their ancestors. Again, I want to praise Father Carson. Working with him has been really a joy. He's a wonderful, wonderful priest and is working extremely hard on this issue. Father Sands also, the Black and Indian Mission Office in Washington. And I just want to praise him for all he has done. You've heard him speak, of course, already. I just want you to keep him in your prayers as well. Some quotes to end here. Treat all men alike, give them all the same law, give them all an even chance to live and grow. All men were made by the same great spirit chief. They're all brothers. The earth is the mother of all people, and all people should have equal rights upon it. Chief Joseph, of course. And from Crazy Horse, the First Nation shall rise again, and it shall be a blessing for a sick world, a world filled with broken promises, selfishness, and separations, a world longing for light again. I see a time of 7 generations when all the colors of mankind will gather under the sacred tree of life, and the whole world will become like a circle again. In that day, there will be those among the Lakota who will carry knowledge and understanding of unity among all living things, and the young white ones will come to those of my people and ask for this wisdom. I salute the light within your eyes where the whole universe dwells. For when you are at that center within you and I am at that place within me, we shall be one. I want to close with this prayer I wrote some time ago, and I use this for our ministry to help the poverty on the reservations, if you will. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen. Lord Jesus Christ, Lord of compassion and strength, we ask for your guiding hand as we come together today to assist our brothers and sisters who are struggling on Indian reservations throughout our great nation. Help us to overcome the challenges we face in this most difficult undertaking. In the spirit of reform, open the minds and hearts of our government leaders so they may come together and devise a system that is fair and equitable to our native peoples who have suffered so long from the many social injustices that have extinguished their hope. Assist us in our work. Allow us to be a beacon of light. Give us your grace to reach out to the most vulnerable, create jobs and opportunities where they are most needed, to help families subsisting on meager government incomes, those in substandard housing, the dispossessed first peoples of this land, so that we may achieve the needed changes inspired by the gospel. We ask this in your name. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, thank you very much. I hope this was beneficial, and glad I didn't run over time. I'm always looking at a clock here. That's my whole life, is looking at a clock, I think. But anyway, I guess, are there any questions, I guess, is the next thing. I'll do the best I can. I don't know if I can answer them all, but hopefully this was beneficial. Thank you for listening.
All right. We want to thank you, Rich, for your presentation today. A lot of facts, a lot of information to take in. At this point, you can feel free to either submit a question in the chat. You're also welcome to turn on your camera, turn on your microphone, and pose a question or comment to Rich in real time.
I'm here.
So I'll start. Rich, do you have a website where all of this information can be readily found?
Well, I am in the process of getting a new Mac, and my website is a year or two needs updating. I do have the Native American material mentioned there because I do speak on this topic a lot. I have many topics I speak on. The best thing I can do is I can give you my email and let me know if there's anything. I'm sorry this isn't posted as such. No, it's not as I have here. And I will share my slides and information with anyone that wants it. It's not a problem. Got a pencil, my email address. Probably got too many emails here, but it's richmay33, RICHMAY 33 at me.com, richmay at me.com. And if you'd like any of this I have here, I'll be glad to share it with anyone who would like to have it.
All right. So I see we have a few people coming on, and we have a question in the chat from Margaret Moore.
Okay.
Is there a mechanism for the leaders of various tribes to get together and work together for the progress of their tribes?
Yeah, it's interesting you brought that out. I think Father Mike is working this too. 2 years ago, let's see, I'm losing track of years with this COVID thing. I guess it was 2019. We had the poverty conference at Notre Dame, and I drove on up there for that. And we had a lot of tribal people there, and we actually went through a lot of the issues and problems that they faced. And it was a very good session because a lot of that information now is feeding right into Father Carson's work. You probably heard his opening address about the new document that the USCCB is putting out. But certainly, I believe they do have regional discussions. I have not been part of those. Obviously, the more people can get together and discuss these and come up with a consolidated list of things that need to be done. But again, I've been supporting Father Carson in this, and he has collected a lot of this. I hope that helps answer the question.
All right, thank you. Would anyone else like to ask a question?
I'm just really very happy that this whole history has been, part of the conference for this year, because somehow it's never gone this deep. I don't know if I've been going to the conferences since the early 70s, I think, when Native Americans first got to come. There were about a handful of 10 or 20. It was all priests and deacons or bishops. And I got to go to Arizona or to wherever it was. Anyway, I just think this is really important, that we're not just like the topping on the ice cream and the dessert on the, we can't talk about Christ if we're not going deep and start living the gospel. And this is totally, I have read a book called the history of the Native American history. Anyway, I got it over here, and I just want to put it in the chat there because the title, it's been really revealing about how this whole history has unfolded, and my realization is just, it's overwhelming. So thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you for listening, and just keep all this in your prayers. It's been very difficult driving up there from Houston, but we have a lot of good people I'm in touch with there too, and working very hard, and that gives you hope. So thank you.
Rich, what was the name of that book and the author again? Something like New Trail of Tears?
Yes, it is excellent. I recommend this book to anyone who wants to really get really a grasp on this. A lot of the information and my learning of this has been started with this book, The New Trail of Tears. The New Trail of Tears by Naomi Schaefer Riley, Naomi. You'll see it online. Naomi. You don't need the middle name, Riley, Riley, and it'll come up. It's not a hard read, but I'll tell you, it's been sort of my workbook or my starting point when I got into all of the more complicated stuff that we're dealing with here. She did an excellent job. She went to Prager University, I believe, if I'm pronouncing that right, and I still communicate with her occasionally. She did a great job. I highly recommend that book.
Thanks a lot. I'll get it.
Mhm, mhm.
I would just like to thank you for putting this presentation out, because again, there's so many of us that just really don't know the history. And
Yeah,
I did visit Father Henry Sand's office when I was in DC a couple of years back, and I asked him for a bibliography of stories of information so I could learn.
mhm,
I work in the Black community and the Latino community, but have no experience
mhm.
in the Native American community, even though Cahokia Mounds is not far from St. Louis.
Right.
And he gave me a list, and I'm wondering if the Cross and Feathers could put out more resources for everybody to read, what books are recommended, and just to help us to appreciate this heritage in our country, in our midst,
Right.
and other educational tools.
Mhm.
And
Good
the
point.
second- Well, the other thing I want to say too is, in St. Louis, we have a lot of racism, and a lot of it, even among Catholics, because white Catholics and Black Catholics don't know each other. And there's not a mechanism to getting anybody together. We kind of, our group is doing it, and I'm a lady of St. Peter Claver, so we try to bring people together, but even as an official church, we don't do it. And so there's a lot of what Father Mike's Carson's presentation of not dealing with the truth and teaching racism just by lack of association and relationship with each other. And even criticism of African-American Catholic liturgies. People don't like it because it's not white European. And yet they've never been to an African-American church or a Latino Catholic church. So I just applaud what you're doing. I was at Pine Ridge in South Dakota for the last Tecowitha conference. The liturgies were outstanding. And I think you do a wonderful job. And please, everybody here, continue that work. We need it, because I just remember one of the talks by one of the Jesuit Father Winzenberg, I think it was,
Yes.
at Pine Ridge. He said, one culture cannot exhaust the mystery of the incarnation. And what poverty is there for all of us if we know only one culture and we say we love Jesus when he's been speaking to everyone for all these years. So
Oh,
thank
yeah. So true. So true. And yeah, my involvement with the Lakota has gotten me into their Lakota spirituality. And the most remarkable, I have these, I just gave a talk to the Mariological Society of America, and the white buffalo calf woman, her appearance to the Lakota in the late 1700s, and the Jesuits coming into that area there. And here we have a template for Catholicism. That's how advanced their religious spirituality is. It's just absolutely, it was just breathtaking as I got into this thing, how God has implanted, just without even knowing any divine revelation, basic principles that they could have easily grown into with the Jesuits coming in there, and so for the missionaries. And that's been another. In fact, I give a talk on the white buffalo calf woman. I have a comparison chart between Our Lady of Guadalupe appearances and this appearance to the Lakota, and the parallelism is just absolutely uncanny. And so anyway, not to get into that, but the point I'm making is that understanding the spirituality of our native people and how rich it is, I think, is an important part of being able to appreciate their culture.
definitely.
Well, I hope you'll join me tomorrow. I'm going to be talking about socialism. socialist policies on an Indian reservation, what is socialism, and show how a lot of the hardships they have today is linked to a policy that just doesn't work. And I know many of you know that this is a threat to our nation as well in general, and I've been giving talks on that too. But the point is I hope by doing this talk here today, looking at the Indian laws and so forth, you can see how now this problem is accentuated when you do the boots on the ground and you actually go out there to see the result of this and the impact on these people. And so anyway, that's my advertisement for tomorrow. And so hopefully you can make it and listen to that too.
Good for you.
All right, we have about 5 minutes left. If anyone has any last minute questions or comments, or even things you're curious about that maybe Rich didn't cover today, he may very well get to it tomorrow. But if you have any other questions, feel free to submit. Again, we have about 5 more minutes.
I'd like to ask Rich a question about the various tribes. Some are Catholic, some have their own native religions.
Right.
Does that make a barrier between the various tribes, or can they get together no matter what denomination? Because I see it even between Black and Latino Catholics and evangelicals and whatever. Sometimes there is not a bridge or a potential to dialogue.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And that's actually, I've discussed that with Father Mike there a few times too, how it was my experience that certainly, and Black Elk to me is going to be very crucial in getting to what you're bringing up here, because he was able to practice his Lakota religion and still be a Catholic.
Mhm.
And that's a very important thing, is that where it doesn't conflict, obviously. And again, I look at the Lakota spirituality. I see no reason why you cannot practice your cultural traditions in that regard and still go to a Catholic church, and practice the Catholic faith. Now, I'm not an expert in all of these various spiritualities, but certainly from what I've been exposed to, as I said, Black Elk, you study the story of Black Elk, he actually states that very fact, that he did not have to abandon his cultural traditions. And so we've got to figure out ways to be able to bring that to light and be able to be inviting and get our Native American populations and cultures to understand that you don't have to abandon your practices. So anyway, that's the way I see it. That's a very good point. It's a very important point.
I think Stoltzman's material working on the sacred pipe
Yes.
gives us a model for Catholicism speaking with Lakota spirituality or somebody else's spirituality.
Yes, exactly. I have that book. In fact, that's where I pulled some information out on the white buffalo calf woman that you bring that up. I've read his book. I've got it. Yes, very true. That is another good reference. Very good reference. I got it. I almost didn't reach here. I'm looking behind me. I got all my books here, but yeah, that is a very good one. Yep, here it is. Yeah. And Epps too, the sacred pipe. Joseph Epps, the sacred pipe. I found a lot of interesting things in there. A parallelism too between the buffalo, the meat on the buffalo is symbolic, very similar to the real presence of Jesus in the Holy Eucharist, how they regarded the sacred nature of that part of the buffalo. It's just a whole bunch of things that are just, I sit there and absolutely amazed how the parallelism and the thinking there is. So again, that's another one, the sacred pipe that's Black Elk's account of the 7 rites of the Laurel Sioux by Joseph Epps, EPES, Joseph Epps Brown, I guess is the full name.
All right.
Anyway.
Well, we want to thank Rich for this presentation today. And if you found yourself leaning forward, wanting more, tune in tomorrow. And if there are any other workshops that you may have missed, perhaps you were in Rich's workshop, but you still wanted to hear about that other one. Most of our workshops are going to be available on demand. You can log back in maybe tonight or after the conference is over, and you can watch the sessions you missed. There's a little replay button when you click on the session. So that is available for you. Again, thank you, Rich. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, but if you want, you can offer closing comments.
No, again, just let's just stay in prayer on all of this.